All of the ghost stuff notwithstanding, if I had a friend who had a huge house in high school and I could live there, I would have been there in a second. Pretty cool.
When I was 18, but still in high school, I moved in with a friend who had this huge house to herself. Her parents owned it, and it was on their property, but it wasn't super close. They owned a good chunk of land. It was an old house with an old steel brick fireplace in the den. The fireplace had a heavy door that shut and latched with effort to heat the house. We always built a good fire, and then shut the door and locked it before bed. One night I was brushing my teeth, and I heard that big, heavy steel door open. I assumed it was my roommate checking on the fire, but when I called out to her, I could tell she was in her room, opposite of the den with the fireplace. So, I walk over to peek into the room and noticed the shadows from the fire dancing on the walls. The steel door was wide open. I walk into my friend's room and crawl into her bed. I said, "If you didn't open the door, why is it wide open?" As soon as the sentence left my mouth, we both heard that steel door slam shut. It shook the walls, it slammed so hard, it scared the absolute F out of both of us. It sounded like an effing train was smashing through. She wanted to call her dad, who lived down the road, but I argued it was 3 a.m. and he would kill us if we woke him up. So, we decided to go check it out ourselves. Armed with flashlights and baseball bats, we slowly walked towards the den. But when we got to the room, the door was not only shut, it was locked. There's no way that door could have done it on its own. It was not only heavy, but also a bitch to lock once it was hot enough. It took the both of us to get it shut, but I know I saw that door open, and I know we both heard it slam and jumped at the same time. This living situation wasn't exactly the best for me, but I liked the freedom it gave me. But over the next few weeks, it was severely impacting me. My usual goofy class clown self was now quiet and spacey. My friends at school kept asking me what the hell was wrong with me. The truth is, I think that house was sucking the life out of me. There was no TV, no radio, not even a house phone. It was out in the country, and I did not have a car, so I was limited on getting anywhere, and eventually my roommate was staying over at her new boyfriend's house full time. So there I was, in this huge house, out in the middle of nowhere with no phone. This was the late 90s. I stopped building fires. I stopped eating. I remember sitting in that den and just staring at the wall until I realized I'd sat there until the sun went down and didn't realize the house was dark. I remember laying in my bed, and the room next to mine, the one we didn't use, made all kinds of noises in the night, scratching and wood groaning as if someone was walking around. That room was full of furniture. You couldn't walk around in there. I just kept telling myself, it's the mice. Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I called my friend to come and get me. The day my family came, my grandma, who doesn't believe in ghosts, she's JW, said she went into my old room to check and make sure we got everything, and said she swore she heard someone laughing. I've never been back to that house.
All of the ghost stuff notwithstanding, if I had a friend who had a huge house in high school and I could live there, I would have been there in a second. Pretty cool.
I believe my grandfather haunts my house, keeping an eye on all of us. I've had many instances where female friends would come over and randomly ask me if I believed. I'd tell them I do, but ask why. Each time, everyone would say that they had felt a comforting hug envelop their body, as if trying to assure them that everything was all right, usually after they'd had a rough day or week. I've also seen things in my room move on their own, like the clothes in my closet move as if a hand had swiped from right to left, as if looking through what I had hanging up. I've seen and heard things as well, almost like an apparition moving through in the hallway in front of my grandmother's room, as if he's standing guard or watching over her. Lots more, but those are really the main things I've seen. Toddler cousins started telling stories about the man in the dress. The man in the dress lived in their house and told him stories. The man in the dress says the soup is boiling dry. It was. My grandmother was visiting and sat in an armchair. The kind only one person can fit in. Cousin, you're sitting in the man in the dress. He's in the chair. Everyone. Cousin, it's all right. He doesn't mind. This went on for months. One day, the family is all there, and my cousin's mother pulls out a photo album. Everyone is looking through the photos, reminiscing. My cousin is playing on the floor. Suddenly, he gets up and toddles over. That's the man in the dress, he says, pointing at a man in a suit. The man in the picture is my grandmother's uncle, who died several years before my cousin was born, wearing a dressing gown, in that house, in that chair. No one has ever talked about him since my cousin was born. How often do you hear about your grandmother's uncle who died before you were born? The man in the dress stopped turning up in my cousin's conversations after the great-uncle's daughter came to visit, and my cousin told her that the man in the dress said he loved her and he was sorry. She cried but wouldn't explain it. I sort of have a family obligation to be at worst neutral on the subject of ghosts. 2 experiences. 1. One morning I was woken up by 3 taps on my head and a male voice saying my name. Thinking it was my dad, I groaned and slunk deeper under my sheets. The taps and calling of my name happened again, so I turned to ask my dad why he was waking me up so early on a Saturday morning and no one was there. Freaked me out, so I quickly got up and dressed. 2. This is more of a recurring thing than a one-time event, but I fully believe something evil exists in my grandmother's house. When I lived there with my mother, I would occasionally sleep in the living room for the novelty of it, and every now and then I would hear growling and scratching coming from the kitchen that would paralyze me in fear. I also had a few other experiences there, such as one time being pushed down the stairs and no one being there when I looked up and seeing things out of the corner of my eye. I haven't been back there since I moved out. I refuse to. My grandmother died, and we went to the morgue to say goodbye. As my mom, dad, and I stood there around the dead body laying on the table, suddenly, just for a blink of a second, there was like this green flame about 1 to 1.5 meters above the body. I blinked a couple of times, not quite knowing if I had imagined it, but when looking at my dad's face and seeing his expression of disbelief, I knew it wasn't in my head. It almost seemed as if right there and then, after waiting for us to come and say goodbye, her ghost left her body and, who knows, this world. I have a few experiences that I don't know what to think of. Maybe ghosts, maybe not. 1. The first night I spent in my new house, I heard someone walking around downstairs. Sounded like a lap of the ground floor. Then the stairs started creaking. Thinking it was a burglar, I grabbed the crowbar and I keep under the bed and hid next to the bedroom door to smash anyone who tried to open it. No one opened the door, and there was no sign that anyone had been in the house in the morning. All doors and windows were locked. This happened every couple of nights for the first month. 2. One time, I was driving my truck back to the yard, and the brakes engaged by themselves. A kid ran into the street not 2 seconds later. This is an old garbage truck without any of the self-driving gadgets. 3. There's a big old cemetery not far from my place that loads of people use as a walking trail. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's been laid out like a wooded park, and there's a bunch of deer in there that don't mind people as long as you stay out of arm's reach. So I wander over every so often to watch the deer. One time, I was in the oldest section at the back, and all of a sudden I got so dizzy that I had to sit down under a tree. Shut my eyes for a second, and it was immediately out cold. I woke up to a loud snort from the biggest buck I've ever seen, standing maybe 10 feet away. By then the sun was going down, so I'd lost at least 2 hours there. It was so hard to walk back to the entrance of the cemetery, but the second I passed through the gate, I felt perfectly fine again. The buck and a few of his friends followed me all the way to the gate. At my house, no one else lives here, sitting in my bedroom at 5 a.m., playing a game on my PC, door open. Dog in the doorway lying down. My mom, at the time, lived about 2 miles from me and was likely asleep. Clear as day, in her voice, I hear from my kitchen my mom call my name. I turn my head and my dog starts doing that intruder alert growling, like he's about to rip into someone that's not supposed to be there. Of course, nothing was there, and my mom was at her own house, perfectly fine asleep, and that's the craziest, spooky thing ever to happen to me. The dog barking and growling is what really has me thinking that shit was real. When I was around 17 to 18 years old, I had a hesitant approach to getting my driver's license, so I was really late to actually get one. I just had very little interest in learning how to drive until my parents talked me into it, and as soon as I was comfortable behind the wheel, I took every opportunity to go out for a drive. Near the end of my student driver period, I checked my log and realized I still needed a few night driving hours, so I asked my dad if he could come with me. He obliged and asked where I wanted to go, to which I responded stupidly that I had seen a graveyard through the trees on the side of the highway and I wanted to check it out. Dad was hesitant to agree because it was the middle of the night and we had rules set in place specifically not to do things like this at night and especially alone, but because he would come with me, he bent the rules a bit. A 20-minute drive later, we turned onto the side street that is so neglected that fallen trees have crossed part of the road, and I used my headlights to look past the gate into the graveyard. We couldn't actually open them since they were chained shut, and Dad was at an age where he couldn't hop fences like he used to, so we didn't bother going in and just talked. Only a few minutes later, the light inside of the car started to buzz, and we both recognized that it was the same buzzing electronics get when there's too much energy running through. My radio cut out. The dashboard went dark for a moment, and then my tachometer went from 2,000 to 6,000 in the span of a few seconds. I put the car into neutral, and the car lurched back downhill away from the gates. Despite it being in neutral, and the decent incline leading away from the hill, the car stopped and the engine revved again. My dad yelled at me to stop pressing the gas or I'd blow up the engine, and I remember screaming, "I'm not doing anything." Just to prove I was telling the truth, I pulled both of my hands off of the wheel and both feet back against the bottom of the driver's seat. A moment before the car lurched forward up the hill towards the gate, and the cemetery, all lit except for the headlights, went completely dark, and I had to rely on the only headlight to switch from park, reverse, neutral, drive. Nothing was working, and both of us were freaking out. Dad slammed his fist on the dashboard so hard that whatever was causing us to move let go, and didn't bother asking what had happened, just moving the gear to reverse and pulling out. I tried to put the car back into drive to get away from the cemetery, but the engine stalled again, and despite being in drive, with my foot on the brakes, the car wheels moved backwards further up the road past the gates. Now for context, the paved road only continued for about 10 feet past the cemetery drive, and after that was a 6 to 12 inch drop into loose beach sand, and both of us knew that if the car got stuck, we would have no way to get home. Switching between the gears again, none of them worked until I got to drive again, and suddenly it worked. I didn't ask questions, and we sped off back down the road, and I admit I ignored the speed limits. Both of us were confused, and I at least was shaking from the encounter, but as we reached an intersection to bring us back onto a minor highway, I was forced to stop and wait for a break in the traffic. When we finally found one, the tachometer was still highly sensitive, so I tried not to go too quickly. A little less than half a mile down the road, every light in the car went off, including the headlights, so I, as the novice driver, now navigating with little traffic around, no moonlight, and no streetlights to help, was ordered to pull off onto the side of the street, nearly threw the car into the ditch in the attempt, and I just remember Dad saying, "Get out, I'm driving." I wouldn't complain. So we switched, but nothing he did would turn the car back on, and when he checked the engine, the battery had exploded, and the engine was so hot it was literally steaming. We had to wait 2 hours for a tow truck, and the rest of our family didn't believe us when we told them until the next morning. My mom seemed shaken up, and she would only tell me months later that she had a nightmare where she was in the car with us, experiencing every detail, even ones we hadn't told her, down to the last minor actions we did. The only difference was that she could see what was dragging the car. She described it as a sandhill crane, wings extended, completely ink black and barely visible against the forest behind it. It had its talons grabbing the bumper and flapped to move the car where it wanted us to go, and only at the end of the dream, where we drove away from the cemetery, did it let go and watched us drive off. My mother had no way of knowing the details she described in the dream, down to the exact words that me and my father said in the moment. Perfect recall of what we said that even we had forgotten until she told us and we remembered. In my mind, that has to be something paranormal. Maybe the engine blowing up was just a problem that I unintentionally caused, but I can't explain how she experienced the exact same thing we did, even remembering more than we did, despite not being there. That seriously freaked us out.
So you decided to practice driving in the middle of the night with your father to a cemetery, and then all this paranormal stuff happened. I don't know. Seems a little out there, but glad the car or you are okay.
Maybe not ghosts, but definitely paranormal. I grew up in a small town, rural Arizona, where there's only forest for miles. Most of the town's residents were Native American. This is how I first heard of skinwalkers. I didn't believe the stories as I grew up in a Mormon household and believing in black magic was not supported. I let these stories be exactly what I was taught for them to be. Stories. My closest friend rang late one night. We were newly freshman high schoolers, and she had taken this new milestone to experiment with sneaking out. I figured she needed a place to stay from another night crawl rendezvous. I answered the phone and am greeted with her shaky breaths. Me. Hey, where are you? My balcony door is open if you're heading this way. Her. They're effing real. They're effing real. I snuck out with Josh. We were at the top of our road and down by the stop sign, and we saw this skinny, hunched-over white person, nearly transparent from how white it was. Josh saw too. The moment we both realized what we were looking at wasn't human, it connected eyes with us. It grew, Kelly. It stood up like 7 feet tall. Its face was a deer. I listened in silence, took a gulp, and asked her again if she needed to come stay with me. I'd let my younger sister, whom I shared the room with, know that Bella might be staying that night. Bella said, no, we ran back to Josh's house and locked the doors. We're okay. I'm just scared. I didn't think they were real. I didn't think so either. We hung up, and I dared not to tell my younger sister. I didn't want to scare her. I was shitting myself though. My younger sister asked what Bella was doing, and I just replied that she was on a walk. We turned off the lights. Moments later, a rhythmic tapping can be heard on our large bedroom window. We lived on the second story of our cabin, above the garage. Our window was nearly 10 feet from the ground. Kelly, what is that? With all of my bravery, I peek at my window. A long, skinny, huge hand is tapping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tap, 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 over and over again. Don't look at it. It'll only invite it further. Close your eyes and just ignore it, I tell my sister. I hear small sobs coming from her bed. I'm just as scared but can't show it. It'll go away if we don't acknowledge it, don't worry. The tapping did eventually go away, but the paranormal instances grew worse after that night. I can comment some other stories that are equally terrifying that happened while I lived in that forest. When I was 9 to 10 years old, my grandfather sat on the end of my bed, woke me up and told me he just passed away 15 minutes beforehand and that he loved me. I got out of bed and ran through the house to my mom to tell her what happened when she got the call. Okay, so this was a couple of months ago. I was sitting in bed just relaxing, lights off, just LEDs that were on my room was lit up, but not fully. So I'm just chilling, watching something, and I'm like, God damn, it's late. I'm gonna go to sleep. So I get ready and try to go to sleep. Then I get up to drink some water that was on my nightstand. I see this tall black figure zip across my room, knocking a picture off of the wall. I was terrified. The next morning I asked my mom about it. She was like, oh my God, I guess you've met George. I've seen him a couple of times in my life. What the hell, George? Answer: the Masonic Center I belong to is one of the top 10 haunted buildings in our state. I've had 3 incidents with spirits there. One of them I was with another person. We were in the lodge room practicing floor work, and my phone suddenly flew off the bench I sat on and landed about 3 to 4 feet away from where I first set it. The 2 of us were the only people on that floor. We do not have earthquakes to any large degree, no windows in the lodge room. We could not come up with any explanation of how this could have occurred other than that the resident ghost, Lewis. My personal encounters include a woman dressed in formal walking down the hall towards our ballroom. No event was going on, and the pages of the Bible placed on the altar flapping. I believe the spirit of our cat wanders our home also.
I could see how a Masonic temple would be haunted. I mean, the occult, things like that. Any Masons out there? Any thoughts?